Hey, everybody, welcome back to the podcast. You're listening to the longest running superhero role playing game on earth. I'm your host, the GM, and first and foremost, happy Halloween. As is befitting this holiday, in today's video, we'll be talking about some spooky stuff that we wouldn't normally talk about. But before we get into it, smash like, make sure you're subscribed, and leave us a comment. We've got a great community here, and it's all thanks to you. So thank you so much for being here. With all that said, let's dive in. So, for those who follow the channel, we have obviously been talking quite a bit about pop culture in the 1980s. But something we haven't talked about yet was the explosion of horror movies in the 80s. In my humble opinion, before the 80s, for the most part, horror seemed like more of a mental thing. But due to advancements of special effects in the 1980s, it seemed to me like horror movies became more of a spectacle than they had been before that. Or at the very least, they were in the mainstream in a way they weren't before. As a kid in elementary school, the character I feel like I heard about the most was Freddy Krueger. To me, he always seemed like he was the king of the 80s horror movie genre, followed closely in second place by Jason Voorhees. But I actually missed out on all of that stuff because when I was a kid, I wasn't allowed to watch any of it. And the reason for that is kind of interesting. At least I think it's interesting. I'm not sure what others will think of it. Anyways, so my mom passed away in 1995, and about a dozen years later, her mother, my grandma, also passed away. And they were the two people who basically raised me. There at the end, my grandma was in an assisted living facility, and the whole family showed up to be there with her at the end. And something kind of weird happened. It turns out that my family has a lot of secrets that I never knew about. There were a bunch of things that they didn't want getting back to grandma. So there at the end, they started telling stories in the lobby of this place. And that facility had a rule that only 3 or 4 people could be in grandma's room at a time. And grandma had a ton of kids, and most of them had a ton of kids. So there were a lot of people there, taking up all the couches and chairs throughout the place. Anyways, so my Aunt Lucy was one of the ones telling these stories. And at one point, I heard her talking about me, but she was being very quiet. So I thought she was talking behind my back. So I kind of loudly asked what she was talking about. And she said that the whole family thought that I was abducted by aliens as a kid. Mind you, this is them claiming this, not me. So I was quiet for a second, trying to figure out if she was just like screwing with me or something. So I said something to that effect. Then not only did Lucy insist that she was serious, but more and more family members joined with her. And first of all, I was blown away that they even believed in aliens because nobody in the family had ever mentioned aliens ever. And furthermore, I was incredibly surprised that they were convinced I was an abductee. So I said I didn't think I was ever abducted. Lucy said that if aliens had wiped my memories, then I wouldn't remember it. And I wasn't sure what to say to that. And honestly, I still felt like maybe this was a practical joke of some sort, but it wasn't. I said I thought maybe they were saying it to tease me because I liked science fiction. And my uncle Norman chimed in and said I was the only one in the family who did like things like science fiction. And maybe my supposed abduction was why I gravitated towards such things. Then my Aunt Jean said something, and this is super embarrassing, but I'm going to share it with you anyways. So she said there was an old movie that came out in the early 80s called E.T. the Extraterrestrial. And she said that all the other kids saw it and loved it, but I saw it and seemed triggered. And I don't remember this, but according to her, I screamed and I cried and I had nightmares for years, which seems ridiculous, right? Because it's ET. Um, Anyways, but so Jean is a nurse and she had been her whole life, and she said that was a classic sign of trauma. So here the entire family was, and still is, by the way, convinced that I was abducted by aliens as a kid. And it turns out, before I was born, my Uncle Norman was driving home one night after dark, and I'm not making this up, for Halloween, by the way. He was supposedly driving home after dark, and he came around the curve and he could see our farmhouse, and he saw a ball of light over the farmhouse, like a big one. And he said it was so bright that the entire farm was as well lit as it would be if it were noon. Then the light flew straight up, and the whole family got really sick, except for Norman. And they had nausea, vomiting, headaches, diarrhea, loss of appetite, fatigue, fever, and seizures, which, as it turns out, are all signs of radiation poisoning. And weirdly, around that same time, when my grandma passed away, when they were in the nursing home thing, the not a nursing home, a assisted living, thing, and everybody was talking about this, like I had been having seizures at that point, which I thought was the emergence of my brain tumor, which, fun fact, is on my pineal gland, which is sometimes associated with psychic powers, which in turn are sometimes associated with the whole UFO thing. So point being, there was this time when I was a kid where I had nightmares for years and flipped out over the movie E.T., which, like I say, is super embarrassing. But at any rate, so my mom figured I probably shouldn't be watching actual horror movies then if E.T. bothered me that much, right? So yeah, as long as she was alive, I never saw Friday the 13th or Nightmare on Elm Street or any of that stuff. Although there was an afternoon once where my local UHF TV station played Night of the Creeps and Reanimator as a sort of Saturday afternoon double feature. I watched those with my door locked since I wasn't allowed to watch horror movies, and I loved them both. I can't remember which one I saw first, but they were for sure the first two horror movies that I ever saw. I want to say Reanimator was first, and for sure, Night of the Creeps is my favorite horror movie of all time. At some point, I also saw the 1986 version of Invaders from Mars, which you could argue whether that's horror or science fiction or whatever, but I loved that one too, partially because in it, there's this path. It's kind of like a dirt road behind the main kid's house, and it was uncanny how much that resembled the path behind the farm where I lived as a kid. But that was about it, as far as I can recall, in terms of me seeing horror movies in the 80s. In the mid 90s, though, I was in college, and my best friend at the time was this guy named Carlson Barber, and he loved horror movies. One day, he mentioned a little franchise called Evil Dead and its protagonist, Ash, and I had never heard of any of it. So Kelson rightly decided to show it to me. And of course, I loved Ash. I thought he was really funny. So throughout college, Kelson showed me the greats. So Freddy, Jason, all that stuff. I remember one time, actually, we watched one of the Friday the 13th movies. And now I couldn't tell you which one it was, but as we were watching the movie, I realized we were actually watching it on Friday the 13th. So I said something about that, and Carlson was like, "Yeah, that's why I picked it out to watch today." And in the movie, the power goes out. And then as soon as the movie was over and Carlson took the VHS tape out of the VCR, the power went out on my farm, right? And Carlson was from the city. So it being Friday the 13th, and there was a thunderstorm, and now there was a power outage. in the middle of nowhere. He got really scared and he drove home very quickly. But we never quit giving him a hard time for that. Anyway, so I played catch up. And I think that when we were kids, maybe other kids my age were watching these movies with friends and there was more of a social component to it. In the 90s, though, when I wanted to watch 80s horror movies, either nobody wanted to watch it with me because they'd seen it a million times, or if they did watch it, they'd ruin the ending for me because they couldn't stop blurting out stuff about what was going to happen next in the movie. And as such, I would tend to watch most of those old movies then by myself. Also, I just, for whatever reason, would usually watch them in the afternoon. I feel like I was working a lot of second shift jobs. Like I was a pizza delivery boy for a while and stuff like that. And I would come home tired from work and just go to bed. So the free time that I did have was in broad daylight. You know what I mean? Which is also not really helping with the whole horror movie thing, right? So even though I was finally watching this stuff, I still feel like that probably wasn't the way they were meant to be received. And most of the stuff I was watching, I don't think hit the way it did for others. And also by this point, I'd been playing role-playing games like Dungeons and Dragons for years, and I think it affected how I saw horror movies. So, for those who are unfamiliar, in Dungeons and Dragons, when some sort of a monster shows up, typically the character you are playing has like a sword or something like that, and he hacks and slashes at the monster until it's dead, right? And then some monsters, like say a troll, can only be hurt by fire. So the hero has to do a little bit of problem solving to figure out what's its weakness and then we're right back to kill mode. You know what I mean? So a horror movie would basically say a monster appears, right? And like a Pavlovian dog, my response is to think, well, the hero needs to hack and slash at this guy or try fire, see if that works. But so for me, there's no fear, right? My brain just goes into gamer mode as an adult when I watch a horror movie. And again, I don't think that's how they are meant to be received. And as such, at the end of the day, while there are a few here and there that I like for various reasons, overall, I've just never really been that into the horror genre, right? So fast forward to the early 2000s when I met my wife, who loves horror. It is like her favorite genre, right? And she wants to watch it with me, but at the same time, she hates watching it with me because as we watch the movie, I'm still in game mode. And I'm like, why didn't he try this? Or why didn't he do that? And she hates that I'm trying to solve whatever the problem is in the movie. You know what I mean? And her brother Scott used to live with us too, and he also grew up on horror movies and loves them, and he also hates how I react to them. Despite this fact, though, at one point, one of them asked me to run some horror themed games for them, which I was fine with. But you might already see where this is going to go wrong, right? So I started with John Redbridge because he's the glue that holds my game world together, basically. He's the guy who's met everybody, right? He's the walking avatar of the transitive property. So the first game that I ran for what I would call a mini campaign or a campaign within a campaign was based on a 1986 movie called Invaders from Mars. And it starts off the same way with a kid named David Gardner, who was played by my brother-in-law Scott, and David's teacher, who I think was named Linda Magnuson, was played by my wife. But early on in the adventure, John Redbridge is seen at a diner in town, and Linda flirts with him because, of course, he has the Valentino effect. And so pretty soon it's the three of them versus this alien invasion. And so we ate pizza, we, drank a few beers, and we rolled some dice. And John Redbridge starts curb stomping aliens big time, right? Because what I didn't realize 20 years ago was that he is the wrong kind of hero for this genre. And let me put it like this. I saw this video on YouTube about the making of Predator, and one of the guys involved said that the Predator was actually inspired by Jason Voorhees. That's why he wears the mask. In Friday the 13th, though, Jason hunts characters who are not peak human, right? They tend to have no fighting experience, etc. So the guys making Predators said, what if we start with the victims and make them the best of the best? What if they were peak human, basically, and had the most combat training possible, the best gear possible, etc.? And then we scale up our bad guy so that he's able to hunt people like this. So if they are peak human, he can't be human. He has to be more than human. And if they have the most high-tech gear Earth can offer, the Predator needed otherworldly equipment. So you get the idea. The point is that John Redbridge is not a hero from a Friday the 13th movie. He's more like a hero from the first Predator movie. And I was dropping him into Friday the 13th, literally. Because as soon as we were done with Invaders from Mars, John and Linda took their act on the road, and the second place they went was Camp Crystal Lake. And like I said, my brain was in D&D mode, so they did their best to kill Jason Voorhees, who by then was for sure undead, by the way. I actually remember us having a huge argument about whether or not Jason was undead, because I thought that Jason drowned as a kid, and when we first see him as an adult, he's already undead by then. My brother-in-law thought Jason survived as a kid, and when we first see him, he's just a human being. Apparently, according to various DVD commentaries we watched, this was a pretty common argument back in the day. So in one of the sequels, they make it very clear from that point on, he is for sure undead and he has the regeneration power. So to avoid arguments out of game, I said that by the time our character got to Crystal Lake, it was after that point. So the Jason that we fought was for sure undead. And since the David Gardner character from Invaders from Mars had died by then, Scott started to play the Tommy Jarvis character from the Friday the 13th franchise. And then after that, we went to Elm Street, where we took on Freddy Krueger, which I liked because if you're a longtime follower of the channel, you may recall that John Redbridge's origin story involves the dreaming. So John versus Freddy seemed really like appropriate to me. The character my wife had been playing wasn't dead or anything like that, but my wife got tired of playing her, so she decided to switch over to playing Nancy Thompson from the Freddy franchise. And she played her, at least in my humble opinion, more like Ellen Ripley from Aliens. And likewise, the Tommy Jarvis character to me felt more like either Hicks from Aliens or like Reese from Terminator, in that he too was now proficient with guns and, combat, etc. And after each adventure, I'd give the players experience points, which they, of course, use to raise attributes and skills, etc. So the heroes were becoming better and better at hunting down monsters and killing them, which, like I was talking about earlier, seems to be the antithesis of what a horror movie is all about. And I think that's why we stopped playing with those characters. They never died or anything. At this point in our timeline, those characters would assumedly still be out there somewhere hunting down supernatural threats and exterminating them. But after that, when I ran something horror themed, I made sure to give the heroes a lower amount of points to use to make their characters with. I ran Scooby Doo versus Night of the Living Dead, and the Mystery Incorporated kids were not on the same level as Dutch from Predator, to say the least. So they had trouble dealing with zombies, and that game was extremely well received. I also watched more horror movies with my wife, and I shut my mouth since she didn't like what I had to say, and I took notes. So, for instance, after that, I'd run a horror game and I'd find an excuse to feature an apartment building with out of date architecture. I'd always describe the floor as being white and avocado green linoleum checkered tiles, and the light overhead is flickering on and off during a storm. And the reason I did that was because you wouldn't believe how many movies my wife watches with that scene in it. My players had seen that in a zillion different films, and subconsciously, as they imagined themselves standing in that hallway, the players, would begin to experience fear. So my horror stuff got better over time. I've also raised the question in my circle of gamers of what even makes a horror movie. And different people come up with different answers, of course, but at least for me as the GM, I tend to lean towards the idea that one of the differences between a horror movie and a action movie, for the most part, is that in action movies, the good guy wins in the end. While in the horror genre, it might also involve monsters or aliens or something that you could also have in an action movie, but the good guys often lose, or at the very least, they lose a friend, or they lose something that was extremely valuable to them. They just seem like they pay a bigger price in the horror genre. So if a game is balanced, or if you use challenge ratings or something along those lines, things that are a gut instinct for a lot of GMs, I personally feel like those actually work against the horror genre. And if you really want it to feel like a horror movie, the GM needs to be more unfair than he might normally be. Start the heroes off with some sort of a disadvantage, um, screw them over as often as possible. Stuff that in any other game, your players would hate it, right? But at least in my experience, when it comes to the horror genre, my players go into a horror game and they actually sort of want that experience. It's not that they really want to win or survive. To me, it seems more like they just want me to scare them, and those things help with that. My players would rather have their character die if, in turn, I gave them a jump scare, which I have done. Something that works well for me, by the way, and it's hard, is you have to run the entire game with a softer, quieter tone of voice. Then when the jump scare comes, you get a little more yelly and growly, that kind of thing, and maybe have the villain blurt something out suddenly as you roll the dice for the damage. It's kind of hard to explain. It's one of those things that you would just have to play, perhaps. Speaking of playing, have you ever played a horror RPG? If so, how did it go? What worked? What didn't work? Put that in the comments section. And if you haven't ever played a horror role playing game, maybe just list what your favorite horror movie is or something like that. While you're at it, don't forget to smash that like button and check to see if you're still subscribed. And from everybody here at the longest running superhero role playing game on earth, happy Halloween, and we'll catch you in the next adventure. Bye.